Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. In our previous videos, we've looked at a number of both mainstream and critical theories of international relations. In this video, we're going to apply them. We'll watch a speech by President George W. Bush announcing the launch of combat operations in Iraq in March of 2003. Along the way, we'll identify some elements of the theoretical approaches we've considered so far in the course. On March 20th, 2003, the United States launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. Officially, there were several justifications provided in support of the U.S.-led operation. These centered primarily on three, let's say, contested points. First, that Iraq provided support for al-Qaeda's operation on September 11, 2001, and continued to provide support for al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other terrorist groups. Second, that Saddam Hussein was a dictator who lived a lavish lifestyle while ordinary Iraqis starved and the country's economy stagnated. And third, that Iraq was a rogue state that had pursued chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, or weapons of mass destruction, in contravention of UN Security Council resolutions. While the first and third of these later proved to be unfounded, the war was nevertheless successful by at least one measure. Initial combat operations lasted a little more than a month and officially terminated with the collapse of Hussein's Ba'athist government on May 1, 2003. But peace was elusive, and even as late as 2020, U.S. soldiers and private American military contractors remained in Iraq. In the speech we're going to watch, U.S. President George W. Bush announces the beginning of combat operations in Iraq. As we watch the video, let's pay attention to the justifications he's providing. As we do, I'll point out along the way some of the theoretical contributions he's drawing on.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
All right, so let's pause it right there just after the first opening sentences. Already, I think we can see elements of realism and liberalism in his speech, right? The idea that the operation is intended to disarm Iraq can very much be seen from a realist perspective, right? Iraq presents a threat to American national interests. A disarmed Iraq is in our national interest, and therefore we're going to do that. But literally the very next thing he says, to free its people and to defend the world from grave danger, freeing its people very much is coming out of the liberal or neoliberal perspective, right? The idea that a free people are less likely to engage in conflict, that the United States has a moral imperative to promote freedom and democracy around the world, very much coming right out of the neoliberal worldview. And finally, to defend the world from grave danger. That's an interesting one, right? It can be either liberal or realist depending upon sort of how you frame that danger, right? So in the first sentence, in the first two sentences alone, we've already got examples of liberalism and realism in the speech. Let's keep going.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
Okay, let's pause it there again. Undermining Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war, right? This sounds very realist. Again, it's sort of a threat to the United States, and we're going to prevent Iraq from being a threat. So again, coming out of the realist perspective there. Let's keep going.
More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases, to help with intelligence and logistics, to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense.
All right, pause it there. Why does he place such an emphasis on the idea that this is a coalition of 35 countries supporting the effort? Right? It's a very liberal understanding of the use of force, right? The use of force from this idea is justified in that the international community has expressed its willingness to support the effort. Similarly, that idea of our common defense, right? A very liberal understanding of how the world works. Let's keep going.
To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you. That trust is well placed. The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military. In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality. Saddam Hussein has placed Iraqi troops and equipment in civilian areas, attempting to use innocent men, women, and children as shields for his own military, a final atrocity against his people. I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm. A campaign on the harsh terrain of a nation as large as California could be longer and more difficult than some predict. And helping Iraqis achieve a united, stable, and free country will require our sustained commitment.
Okay, let's pause it there again. We've heard lots of liberal justifications for war in the last minute or two. The idea that we're there to liberate the Iraqi people, the idea that the war is justified because Iraq has no, or at least the Hussein government has no respect for the conventions of war or the rules of morality, the idea of preventing a final atrocity against his own people, and perhaps particularly the idea that we're there to achieve a stable, free, and united Iraq, all drawing very directly from liberal and neoliberal understandings of the nature of conflict in global politics. Let's continue.
We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people.
Okay, let's pause it there again. That one's particularly interesting. The idea that we have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of the country to its own people. That's an interesting one because the first half of that sentence draws from realist understandings of global politics, and the second half draws from liberal understandings of global politics, right? The idea of removing the threat, very realist, right? The Hussein government is seen as a threat to the United States. We are going to address that threat, right out of neoliberalism, the idea of national security. The second half of that sentence about restoring the control of the country to its own people, I think is implicitly at least drawing on liberal notions of international relations, the idea that democratic systems are going to be more peaceful and that we have a responsibility to ensure a democratic system in Iraq, very much coming out of the liberal perspective. Let's keep going.
I know that the families of our military are praying that all those who serve will return safely and soon. Millions of Americans are praying with you for the safety of your loved ones and for the protection of the innocent. For your sacrifice, you have the gratitude and respect of the American people. And you can know that our forces will be coming home as soon as their work is done. Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities. Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory. My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail.
Okay, now I think we're getting into a more realist kind of tenor of the speech. The idea that we will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that possesses weapons of mass destruction, that we will meet that threat now with our military force, and that we will counter any danger to our country, all very much drawing out of realist understandings of international relations.
May God bless our country and all who defend her.
All right, so that's the speech. A couple of interesting things come up there for me. One, an interesting question to think about: why do we see both realist and liberal themes so prevalent throughout the speech? That is, Bush is clearly not drawing from one or the other, but using both. I don't think he's using both explicitly or with knowledge of both theories, but he's clearly influenced by them. Why is that? It's an interesting thing to think about. If I was to give a speculative answer to start, I think it's because much of the foreign policy establishment in the United States is sort of realist in its orientation, but the underlying systems on which the U.S. government is founded are very liberal in their framework, the idea of democracy and the rule of law and those sorts of things. And so when we see foreign policy in operation, we often see it sort of straddling that line, drawing between the two theoretical approaches. The other things I want to think about, or encourage you to think about when you're watching this speech, is how would the critical theories that we've looked at so far in the course respond to this speech? What would they have to contribute or offer? I think we can look to Marxist critiques that would argue that the war in Iraq is really about the control of resources, right? The idea that the United States is trying to assert its dominance in the world militarily, but also economically, and control over Iraqi oil resources was certainly one element of that effort. What about feminist approaches to international relations? I think they would raise a different set of questions about what's going on in Iraq. Certainly, the military establishment is dominated by men and tends to value masculine perspectives on the world. We see this in some of the readings we've done already through the course. We see this in Nuclear Policy. Carol Cohn's article is a great example of this. But feminist scholars would also raise questions about who bears the cost of war, right? The idea that women in Iraq will be disproportionately affected by the violence and the destruction that takes place there. And yet that doesn't appear anywhere in the speech. And so feminist IR scholars would raise questions about that. Finally, constructivist IR scholars would also raise some really interesting questions, I think, particularly around the question of why are we viewing Iraq as a threat at this moment in time, right? Iraq was an American ally for a number of years. The framing of Iraq as an immediate, urgent threat to address is one that constructivists would raise a lot of questions about. And so it's interesting to kind of think through some of those questions. So I hope you found this exercise useful. It's an interesting way to sort of think about the connection between the theoretical approaches we've looked at in the course so far and the real-world application of foreign policy decision-making. So hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, leave them below. Otherwise, I'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.